Hello, and welcome to Zilog and Moto episode 175. I'm your host Dave, and in this video I'll be doing the same thing that I do every night, try to take over the world. Have I made that joke before? It's hard to keep up when you've done this many episodes. Anyway, seriously, if you're new to the channel, what I've set out to do on Zilog and Moto is perform in-depth reviews of every English language game for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. If it can be played on a Genesis with some sort of adapter, and I can actually read what's on the screen, I want to get a copy of it and take a look at it, inside and out. Primarily, the focus is on the officially released library of games from 1986 to 1998 or so, but I do also mix things up and look at the occasional new releases as well, just in case you were curious about that, as there have been some really fantastic games to still come out for these consoles over the last 10 years or so. And then some not so great ones as well, but hey, they all can't be winners. Recently, when discussing the channel with some other YouTubers, the subject came up of, why am I doing this? And granted, I'm paraphrasing the conversation a lot here, but let's face it, YouTube has been around for a long time at this point. And over the years, there has already been a lot of similar content produced by other people. And in a lot of cases, probably better than I do. Better production values, better editing, better writing. So why? Why even bother when primarily to get hits on YouTube, you have to either upload clickbaity shit, top 10 lists where the uploader borrowed video from other sources, What Culture, I'm looking directly at you, or reaction videos to news? Well, the answer is simple. I don't do it for the views, the recognition, or anything like that. I'm doing it because I want to honor this collection of games and all the hard work that went into their creation, whether the result was good or bad. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there will get something valuable from it. Okay, let me get off that soapbox, as if anyone knows what a soapbox is in 2022, and let's get to what should be the star of today's video, and that is Rastan Saga II for the Genesis. This is not the first appearance of a Rastan game on the channel, as I reviewed the port of the original Rastan to the Master System back in episode 75, but this is the first game in the series to appear on 16-bit consoles. Rastan Saga II was known in the arcades as both Nastar in Europe and Nastar Warrior in North America, and it was first released at the tail end of 1988. Later on, in the summer of 1990, the game was ported in Japan to both the PC Engine and the Mega Drive, and then finally, this version of the game, the Genesis version, was released in May of 1991. I'm not exactly sure why an English port of an arcade hack-and-slash game took almost 10 months to be translated, but at least the game was eventually released in the United States, because apparently Nastar didn't do so well in Europe, as it was totally shut out from a home port perspective, and didn't even make an appearance on the Amiga or Atari ST, which seemed like a natural fit to me after the previous game was ported to some of the 8-bit computers over there. Going back to that original game, I did like Rastan on the Master System, but it definitely seemed a bit underpowered. I'm hoping that now, with 16 bits to play with, Taito was able to deliver something a bit closer to the arcades, but I do also recognize that this is an early third-party release for the Genesis, so I have to keep my expectations in check. Let's see what they were able to do, but first, a look at the package.
Okay, and this is my copy of Rastan Saga II for the Genesis. And it is called Rastan Saga II, not Nastar Warrior like the arcade game. I'm not real sure why Taito changed the name to begin with, but as far as the Genesis version not being renamed, I'm going to guess it was because Taito didn't want to redo some of the in-game graphics, and that people were probably still familiar with the Rastan name from the first game anyway. As far as this copy goes, it's in pretty solid shape for an uncommon title. It's not perfect certainly, as the outer cover does have a few nicks here and there, but the inner cover looks fantastic, with maybe just some very minor moisture wrinkling to the rear, and the hang tab is intact at the top. I'd actually never seen a copy of this game before I picked it up, which was a few years ago at a late night flea market that they do around here in Wheaton at the fairgrounds. The late night flea markets are a lot of fun, especially the Halloween one, and you never know what you're going to find out there. And this particular year, I ended up grabbing not only this, but also Atomic Robo Kid, both of which I hadn't seen before at that point, and they were both in great shape. Unfortunately, I don't think I've seen that vendor there again since that year, but who knows, maybe he'll show up again at some point. Getting back to Rastan 2 though, this is an awesome cover. I talk about this probably every time I run across it, but as much as I like the original black cross-hatching formatting to the Genesis covers, these third-party titles from before the red banding era, when they could just use the entire front cover for art, almost always end up awesome. Even a very mediocre game like Space Invaders 91, also from Taito, looks awesome in this format, and it's something that I wish there was more of. Flipping over the back, and there's a very red background that's shared with the spine, but other than that, this layout is pretty similar to first-party Genesis titles at the time, with a large screenshot followed by two smaller ones, and then surrounding flavor text. The screenshots are a little rough, and especially the two smaller ones are hard to make out, with some pretty severe artificial rounded corners that end up cutting off the image. The flavor text to the side is okay content-wise, but desperately needed a copy editor, as there's at least two missing commas, and then this part, now held by a horde of demonic creatures, where they used the wrong spelling of horde. Typos like this are somewhat common for a game with Japanese origins from the era, but come on, I'm sure they could have found someone in, let's see, Wheeling, Illinois to proofread this for them. Opening up the case, and the manual has seen better days, but I've definitely got worse in the collection. As you can see from the outside, it's not very big because, surprise, surprise, an arcade game from 1988 turns out to be not terribly complicated. Even though the game is relatively simple, I do like how the manual starts out with a 2-page story introduction to set the stage for the game, and at the end of the manual, there's 3 pages of concept art for the enemies in the game, identifying them all by name. Along with fleshing out the story via text and art, they've also included a nice section in the middle that covers all the weapon power-ups and other items you'll run across as you play. So even though the manual is somewhat on the brief side, it's definitely still useful for players. Just skip the crappy screenshots that were included. They're just as bad as the ones on the back, except now they're in black and white also. Okay, that's the package. Let's get to the game, and maybe this week I'll get the fun hack-and-slash fantasy game that I was looking for last week. I mentioned not getting what I was looking for in the previous episode, because last week I reviewed Chakan for the Genesis, and if you're not familiar with Chakan, it's a side-scrolling dark fantasy action title, with a main character that does a lot of jumping and slashing, which I'm sure has at least some level of inspiration from arcade titles like Rastan. Unfortunately, Chakan, for all the good things that it had going for it, was ultimately undone by being far too hard to be enjoyable, which is why I was hoping that going into reviewing Rastan Saga II, that perhaps Rastan would serve as a bit of a palate cleanser in comparison. To put it simply, the amount of fun I had this week with Rastan Saga II was far, far more than what I got with Chakan, but that's probably not a totally fair comparison, as even though the games have similarities in themes and combat, they're definitely games that are trying to do different things, with Rastan Saga II clearly being an arcade game versus Chakan being a console game. As mentioned previously, Rastan Saga II started out its life in the arcades, as Taito's follow-up to the original Rastan. While both titles have a passing resemblance to each other, Rastan Saga II features what I would consider to be simpler gameplay from the original. While both games feature nice, colorful graphics, the original Rastan used smaller sprites that were more common in 1987. The game also featured levels that moved not just from left to right, but also from right to left, and also up and down. Rastan Saga II decided to take things in a different direction, and gave up the varied level movement for basic left to right action platforming. You might think that sounds like a step backwards, and it is, with a game that feels much more like the original Super Mario Bros. In level design. But there's a good reason for that simplicity, and that's because the designers decided to go big on sprite design, with Rastan Saga II featuring much larger Rastan and enemies than the original. And while both designs have their pluses and minuses, I gotta say that for a 1988 release in the pre-Neo Geo era, it's very impressive to see these large sprites on screen, and I can definitely understand why they chose to go with simpler gameplay if it allowed them to pull off these graphics and grab the attention of arcade players. But that's the arcade version. What about the Genesis version? Well, one thing that you may know about the Genesis is by default it's designed to handle smaller sprites. When you look at the difference between, say, Streets of Rage 1 and 2, there's a reason why the characters in Streets of Rage 1 are smaller, and that's because to get those larger characters, the programmers have to work a bit of magic to pull it off. And I know I'm grossly oversimplifying all that, but just know that early on, it was much simpler for programmers to get smaller sprites on the screen. So, having said all that, I was fully expecting when going into playing Rastan on the Genesis that I would get a reduced version of the game, that while it looked visually similar to the arcade original, it would be scaled down, as that would have been more in the Genesis graphics wheelhouse at the time, keeping in mind that this version of Rastan dates back to August of 1990 for the Japanese release. Boy, was I wrong, and I must say very happily wrong. Rastan Saga II on the Genesis looks very, very close to the arcade original, large sprites and all. It's not a pixel-perfect port to be sure, but there's no way you can compare the two editions and come out saying that the Genesis version is anything but faithfully graphically. The arcade version has slightly more detail, which is primarily due to being more colorful than the Genesis version, and the backgrounds and animations are a bit better, but for the most part, this is the arcade version. Early on, Sega marketed the Genesis heavily as being able to bring the arcade experience home, and while you probably never saw Rastan Saga II in any of those advertisements due to it being a third-party title, it definitely lives up to that same legacy of Altered Beast, Ghouls and Ghosts, Golden Axe, and Super Hang-On. Now that we've established that Rastan Saga II is a solid port of the arcade game, there's another big question to answer. Is it any good? Well, let's start with those graphics I was just talking about. Since I was gushing about how great a port it is, you'd probably assume that the graphics are great. Well, great might be a bit strong, but I definitely call it at least very good. With having the characters in-game be so large, it allows for a lot of detail to be present on each of them, and I love the art used for all of them. The game looks more than a bit spooky, with some very cool zombies in various states of decomposition, along with skeleton knights, man-sized bats, and ghosts armed with scythes amongst many other enemies. Hell, I probably should have reviewed this game for Halloween instead of Shkan. The reason why I don't go so far as to call the graphics in-game great is that while I think the art used is fantastic, there's not a ton going on here. Animation in the game is minimal, with the game just being a very basic, slow-paced side-scroller. There's not really any special effects to wow the players. Pretty much either you're impressed by the large-sized sprites and detailed art, or you're not. The audio for Rastan is a step down from the graphics. It's not bad at all, but compared to the graphics, I'd call it more just serviceable. It's clear where the emphasis was put, which makes sense for it being an arcade game that oftentimes can't be heard very well to begin with. The music can be a little repetitive at times, but for the most part they use decent sounding synths, so the quality is decent at least. And I would say most of the compositions fit the game well, with themes that get across the various levels of intensity and some ominous creep factor in places. While the soundtrack follows the graphics as just simply not being quite as good as the arcade, but still decent, the sound effects have a much more pronounced drop-off. In fact, they almost got left out entirely. While there is a nice explosion effect for when you turn an enemy into a gory mist, and the plain swish of your sword against the air, there's almost no other sound effects in the game besides that, which is a fairly large step down from the arcade, which even had speech in places. Although, one thing I can say for the Genesis version of Rastan Saga II is that at least it doesn't sound like the PC Engine version. If you're not aware, for as colorful as the PC Engine games can be compared to the Genesis, the music tends to suffer greatly in non-CD titles, as the PC Engine uses a PSG-based sound chip like the Master System. And oh boy, the music absolutely sounds like it. Although strangely, I would say they did a better job with the sound effects in that version, so go figure. I've gone this far and I still haven't actually discussed the game, so I probably should go ahead and do that. Rastan Saga II, like the first game, has levels that are broken up into sub-levels, with each level having 2 standard side-scrolling sections, and then a final boss section that normally is just you mano-a-mano with an impressively large monster. There's a total of 5 levels to get through, and yes, for some bizarre reason, as you may have noticed in the gameplay video, the first level is referred to as Level 0. The arcade version is like that too, and all I can think of is that the story for the game involves Rastan trying to reach the top level of a tower called Skyscraper, with each level being a level in the tower. Calling the ground floor level 0 would make sense if they were using European numbering, but it's a Japanese title. I don't get it. As far as level design goes, each level has its own theme to it, which keeps things interesting. Also, while some of the same enemies appear in multiple levels, the game continuously throws new monsters at you, depending on what level you're in. And I thought that was super cool, as it was sort of a reward for getting further into the game, to see what new crazy looking monster they'd come up with. There's no palette swapping of enemies going on here, to be sure, just some nice variety for the player. Rastan Saga II separates itself from just being an average action title with its controls. It's not overly complicated, only using 2 buttons, but you can't just hammer on the attack button and expect to make it through the game. Every one of the enemies has a strategy that you should use to take them out, assuming that you want to live to see the end of the game. For instance, the bats. The bats can be difficult to take out, as usually they'll fly right at you horizontally across the screen, and while you can hit them as they come at you, you'll probably take a hit in the process, losing valuable health. Instead, it's more advisable to jump in the air when you see them and perform a downward strike, which will take them out while Rastan escapes injury. It's little strategies like that that endear the game to me and get it away from mere button masher territory. Ultimately, I really enjoyed my time playing Rastan Saga II this week. Is it a somewhat simple arcade game from the 80s? Certainly. But that gameplay is actually deeper than you might expect, and the varying weapon power-ups that you can run across can affect how you choose to play through the game. I really like the large detailed graphics, and since it's a somewhat unique look for a game on the Genesis, I didn't even mind that the characters were somewhat stiff looking due to lack of animation. Also, after playing Shakan last week, I was very appreciative of the difficulty in Rastan, which isn't easy, but it also makes sense and is fair. And each time that I would die and have to start over, I was able to get a little further with what I had learned in my previous run, and more importantly, I wanted to try again. All told, I'm giving Rastan Saga II 3 stars. It's not a perfect game by any means, but I had fun playing it, and there's a very good chance that it'll end up in the top 10 list at the end of the season.
Okay, that was Rastan Saga II for the Genesis. I try not to complain too much about reviewing bad or disappointing games, as clearly I knew going into this that if I was really going to review every game, that there was going to be some stinkers in there. But man, I really needed Rastan to deliver after getting let down by Shakan last week, and thankfully it gave me almost exactly what I was looking for. Rastan Saga II is what I would consider a bit of a hidden gem on the console, if you're into arcade-style games, that is, and it's not too awful expensive right now, even though it's not what I would consider a common title. Definitely think about adding a copy of it to your collection if it suits your interests. Next week on Zilog and Moto, it's back to the Master System, assuming I don't run into the same headaches I was having last month when playing Master System titles. Fingers crossed. But there's a good chance I might have to get yet another console service soon, which my wallet is definitely not looking forward to. Anyway, assuming my hardware behaves this week, it'll be a look at the Master System port of one of Sega's most legendary arcade titles that, shockingly, was the only way to play the game on a Sega-based home console for almost 4 years. Yeah, I don't know what they were thinking with that. How this game wasn't a launch title for the Genesis is something I'll never understand. But that's what makes next week's title an important release for the console. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 175. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos, but most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.